The ridge was socked in. Comms were dropping. The lead jet had gone dark 12 minutes ago, and no one knew if the pilot had punched out or burned in. Medevac teams waited for clearance that never came. Terrain mapping stalled. Wind readings conflicted. Someone mentioned turning back. At the edge of the ops tent, Elena folded her map without a word. She wasn't on the flight list. She wasn't in the brief. But she walked out, crossed the tarmac, and climbed into the only aircraft no one had touched all week. 17 minutes later, they followed her route in. The sun had already begun to harden the tarmac by the time the second round of jets pulled into position. Heat shimmered off the asphalt in long, rising ribbons, bending the edges of the base into a mirage. Across the ramp, the newest generation of fighter aircraft gleamed beneath their sunshields, their paint still glossy from last week's press demo. Foreign crews clustered near the media tent, half in flight suits and half in branded polos, all of them sipping something cold and talking too loudly. A camera clicked once, twice, then burst into rapid shutter fire as someone posed in front of a fuel truck with mirrored sunglasses and a grin wide enough to cross the airfield. Off to the side, near the furthest tie-down strip, stood a smaller figure in silence. Elena Shaw adjusted her belt once, settling the weight of her gloves where they looped against her hip. Her boots were scuffed from fuel pad work, the laces streaked pale from sun and time. Beside her sat a T-38 Talon. Its surface faded to a weather-beaten gray that looked almost matte in the light. The fuselage wore the sun like skin, each panel line visible, each seam marked by age. Its intake edges had been wiped but not polished. The last maintenance tag on the forward gear door fluttered in the breeze like an afterthought. No one else stood near it. A squad of junior officers passed by, one of them swinging a helmet under his arm. His laugh was sharp, cutting the warm air. He tilted his head toward the Talon and said, just loud enough to carry, "Backup Barbie reporting for runway duty." Another one raised his phone and snapped a photo. Caption it still grounded. He muttered, already smiling at the screen. The others chuckled, boots scuffing as they moved on. No one looked back. Elena didn't move. She stood near the nose of the aircraft and ran her hand along the curve of the panel without glancing at the others. Her fingers moved with the kind of practiced care that said she knew every bolt, every rivet line, every tone the skin made when it cooled after flight. The aircraft wasn't warm. It hadn't flown in over 2 weeks. But her hand rested there like it still remembered. Behind her, a ground tech in faded overalls pushed a rolling toolbox back toward the hangar. He slowed for a second as he passed the Talon, then glanced at her before nodding toward the gear. "That bird still holds together better than it should," he said quietly. Mostly to himself. Elena offered a faint nod without turning. The toolbox rattled on. Near the center of the field, a commander's voice echoed over the PA system, announcing formation slots and weather conditions in clipped, confident tones. The new jets were already prepped, their wings folded clean and their flight plans uploaded wirelessly to the helmet. Hugh D's. A ripple of approval moved through the crowd as the F-35 crews stepped into place, each with a crew chief and a support lead trailing behind. No one called her name. No one asked about the Talon. Elena opened her clipboard but didn't look at the sheet. The paper inside had been marked and remarked over the last several days, but none of it mattered today. Her name was nowhere on the board. Her clearance, minimal. Her aircraft, ignored. She took a step back and gave the plane one last look. The wingtip cast a narrow shadow over the gravel, thin and sharp. She checked the edge of the intake again, not because anyone had told her to, but because it was habit. There was no checklist, no instructor, no camera, just memory. And still, she checked. At the edge of the ramp, another round of laughter broke out near the flag tent. Someone was filming again. Elena didn't look up. Her gloves stayed looped at her belt. Her clipboard closed. The Talon sat beside her, quiet and waiting. Neither of them said a word. Elena sat near the back of the flight planning tent, one boot hooked around the leg of her chair, her shoulders still beneath a sun-faded canvas jacket. The air buzzed with overlapping conversations and the steady drone of ventilation fans. In the center of the room, a row of screens displayed flight paths, elevation overlays, and thermal projections. Most of the pilots gathered around the briefing table, sipping from branded thermos cups, their sleeves rolled high, their voices just loud enough to dominate the space. She wasn't invited to the table. She was here to observe, or so the schedule said. One officer glanced in her direction as he moved a tablet across the table. He didn't speak to her, just looked past her toward the coffee urn, then back to his notes. A younger pilot leaned toward the screen and made a joke about elevation shifts too steep for training jets. If anyone wants to take a museum piece through that canyon, now's your shot, he said. Someone chuckled. Another added, might as well strap wings on a lawnmower. No one mentioned the T-38 by name. They didn't need to. It was the only thing left on base with paint that looked washed in chalk. Elena kept her hands in her lap. The folded weather map she carried was marked in pencil-soft edges, sharp lines. She'd drawn it the night before using satellite wind drift and a series of off-grid ridgeline checks from her old logbook. It wasn't flashy. It didn't sync with the new display software, but it showed the path a jet could take if the canyon crosswinds shifted like she thought they would. She laid it on the corner of the secondary desk, away from the main display, and tapped once near the southern slope. No one looked. 3 years earlier, she had flown through that same corridor during a recon run in a twin-engine Scout configured for terrain skimming. The air had been unstable then, too. She remembered the way the wind curled off the valley floor, how it folded above the trees, how you had to adjust 5 seconds before the bank or risk being thrown into your own wake. She had flagged that behavior in her flight logs. Later, she submitted a maintenance concern about drift latency in one of the early fly-by-wire response profiles. The new avionics package was still in testing. She'd noticed a delay between manual correction and actual elevator response when descending under speed, at low altitude. That delay was deadly. Her concern was noted, but not addressed. 2 months later, a different pilot flying a similar bird struck terrain on approach during a canyon sortie. The official report blamed atmospheric density and outdated GPS corrections. Elena had read the brief twice. Her name wasn't in it. Neither was her warning. She had been moved out of that unit not long after. Quietly. No suspension, no write-up, just a change in assignment. The phrasing was polite realignment of roles, expansion of logistics command, but her name no longer appeared beside a tail number. She was given a desk and a passcode. Her logbook stayed with her. Now, each morning, she reviewed canyon routes alone, refining wind corridor overlays no one asked for. Her desk was a folding table in the corner of the auxiliary tent. She pinned printouts to the cork wall in patterns no one else used. She traced altitude with a soft pencil and marked safe roll margins with grease pen circles. Every now and then, someone borrowed one of her routes. They rarely said where it came from. After the meeting broke up, Elena retrieved her map and tucked it back into the inner sleeve of her binder. One of the pages had warped slightly from humidity. She smoothed it flat with her palm before closing it. Outside, the sun had lowered enough to throw long shadows across the hangar lot. The new jets caught the orange light like mirrors. 2 crew chiefs leaned against a tow vehicle, laughing quietly. A third leaned over a tablet and pointed at something on the intake schematic. The T-38 sat alone on the far end of the tarmac, near the edge of the old emergency taxi lane. Its nose faced the gravel berm. Someone had written a joke in marker on the ground crew clipboard last week, returned to sender, but the ink had faded in the sun. Elena walked toward it without speaking. She didn't carry tools, just the binder and her gloves, still looped at her side. When she reached the aircraft, she stopped by the intake and rested her hand against the surface. The skin of the jet was warm from the sun, but cooling quickly. Her fingers traced the contour by muscle memory. Not need. She checked nothing. She adjusted nothing. She just stood there and let the silence stretch. Far across the base, another group of pilots was prepping for a second fly-off briefing. Their laughter carried faintly through the still air. A siren chirped once from the north perimeter. The weather station lights flickered orange, then settled back to green. Elena looked up, scanned the edge of the canyon line in the distance, then returned her attention to the intake. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. A breeze shifted against her collar. She rolled one sleeve down, absent-mindedly, then hooked her fingers beneath the intake seam, not to open it, just to feel its shape. As the sun dipped lower, the ramp cleared slowly. The T-38 remained in shadow. No one called her name. No one asked her to brief the next sortie. She walked the perimeter path around the hangar once more before heading inside, boots steady on the cracked pavement, binder tucked under her arm. The first call came over the secondary frequency, a clipped burst of static, followed by a partial mayday that dissolved before anyone could log it cleanly. Inside the operations tent, heads turned in unison. A tech reached for the master console and raised the volume. The channel hissed, then dropped. Seconds later, another voice broke in, clearer but sharp with strain. It wasn't a distress call. It was a fragment of coordination. One of the intercept pilots was off course and losing signal lock. The radar display updated with a lag. By the time the system caught up, one of the formation jets had vanished from the map. No parachute was spotted. No chute beacon pinged. Just silence. The room changed instantly. Pilots rose from their chairs. Flight commanders crowded around the main table. Someone pulled up terrain overlays, trying to get a fix on the last known heading. Others shouted for updated wind vectors and canyon ceiling reports. 2 ground crews ran out, the side flap of the tent toward the radio tower. The buzz of tension became sharp, frenetic. Screens refreshed. No new data came in. Outside, the sky had already started to shift. The sun wasn't gone, but the color was wrong. It filtered through high clouds and dropped in jagged shafts across the canyon edges. The western range looked harder now, darker. Elena stood behind the third table, quiet, her map folder still in hand. She had come to review alternate corridor drafts for tomorrow's sortie, but now her fingers tightened around the top corner of the folder. She hadn't said anything yet. No one had asked. Inside the tent, the storm built without thunder. A young controller scanned the screens and muttered that visibility had dropped by 20% in less than 6 minutes. The canyon floor fog had started rising earlier than expected. Another tech confirmed that the GPS signal relay across the southern ridgeline was experiencing interference, probably a solar echo or terrain bounce. The last telemetry ping from the second jet showed it flying too low and too fast through narrowing airspace. It hadn't reported back. A lieutenant asked if medevac was airborne. The answer came from the flap entrance negative. One helo was already in spin-up when the crosswind warning grounded it. The other had a lift throttle error from last week's maintenance hold. Both were down. An alternate launch was proposed from the high pad, but a logistics chief shouted that it was being refueled and couldn't clear within 15 minutes. No one was sure if they had 15 minutes. Elena moved her binder to the edge of the nearest crate and opened it slowly. The paper inside had been marked with a red grease pencil the week prior, when she'd updated the wind funnel data along Knife Ridge. It was unofficial. She had built the model using base-side satellite tools and her own triangulations from a recon map she'd memorized 2 years earlier. It showed a passable corridor at a 45-degree elevation cut, usable only during the first 12 minutes of fog descent. No one else had asked for the map. She had kept it anyway. Command officers debated from across the tent. The phrase public optics surfaced once, then was immediately buried by louder talk about authorization and range vectors. Someone tried to push a revised flight plan through the outdated software for canyon access. It glitched. Another officer threw a pen onto the table and said that without satellite confirmation, Nothing could move forward. Someone else asked where the crash was, and two separate hands pointed to opposite zones on the same screen. Elena's thumb traced the edge of her map, pressing just above the grease pencil circle. She did not interrupt. She listened. Outside, the temperature dropped 3 degrees in 4 minutes. The first signs of shadow pooling crept into the canyon, changing the angles of light reflection. Jet crews stepped away from their aircraft, shaking their heads. One pilot muttered that, without a confirmed lock, sending another jet in would be a waste of fuel and a risk of compounding error. There was a brief pause in the chatter, long enough to hear a helicopter engine start, then stutter, then fall silent. The tech monitoring ground support called across the channel that the helo had failed pre-launch pressure check. Everyone turned. No one responded. Elena closed her binder. In that moment, the inside of the tent was filled with the sound of static and nothing else. A new message scrolled across the radar screen. A possible locator ping. Weak, drifting, below the tree line. Too low for satellite confirmation. One of the base coordinators sighed and looked toward the sky. Another shouted into the comms for someone to get a new trajectory model. No one moved fast enough. Elena picked up her gloves. She didn't speak to anyone as she turned away from the map table. She walked out the back flap of the tent, steps steady and unhurried. Her hands moved calmly as she slid the gloves on, one finger at a time. The map stayed open on the table, its red circle clearly visible against the topographic lines. No one called her name. The old runway shimmered in the afternoon heat, barely holding its shape against the growing shadow line. Down at the end of the ramp, the T-38 sat still, its nose turned slightly toward the canyon's edge, like it was waiting for something. A gust of wind slid across the pavement, lifting grit into the air. In the distance, a hawk circled once, then dipped out of sight. The ramp was nearly empty when Elena stepped off the perimeter path and crossed onto the launch apron. The heat from the tarmac had started to lift, not from cooling, but from rising pressure. The wind had shifted. She could feel it in her shoulders, in the stillness just before the turbulence rolled down the ridge. At the far end of the lot, the T-38 waited. No crews circled it. No tags hung from the tail or cockpit latch. It had sat untouched for days. She reached the ladder without pausing. The metal was warm to the touch, but not burning. The panels gave off a soft hum from residual heat, not from power. Elena climbed up, placed her binder beside the seat, and ducked into the cockpit. The canopy stayed open. She ran her hand across the control panel and flicked the master switch. Nothing. She paused, adjusted the auxiliary feed, and tried again. This time the old jet breathed once slow, reluctant. The gauges flickered, then held. No HUD came online, no synthetic voice chimed, just analog dials, yellow backlighting, and the faintest tremor through the seat. From behind her on the ramp, a voice called out, "Uncertain. That's not scheduled." It came from a crewman, maybe 20 years old, standing beside a tug cart with a headset half raised. She didn't answer. Elena moved through the startup sequence manually. The checklist wasn't in front of her. She didn't need it. Each switch followed the last by rhythm, not memory. Left bus on. Fuel boost confirmed. Engine start. The turbines whined once, then caught with a low growl that echoed against the hangar wall. The sound wasn't clean, it was raw. A little dry, but it held. The fuel gauge blinked low, then settled just above the red, enough for one shot. She adjusted the flaps by feel, not sight. The toggles had a give she remembered. The pressure from the left side actuator was slow, then even. The vibration in the seat shifted as the engine warmed, the frame pulling slightly right, then balancing. It felt familiar, not safe, but known. She reached for her helmet. It was a plain shell, scratched near the visor edge, with no name strip and no call sign. She pulled it over her head, buckled the chin strap, and connected the mic jack. though she didn't plan to use it. Her gloves were already on. They didn't match. One was black, the other faded tan. Both were worn thin at the thumbs. Beside the dash, she clipped the last folded edge of her hand-drawn map. It fluttered slightly in the cabin breeze. She tapped the altimeter once. The needle bounced, then steadied at 900 feet. The canopy lowered. Inside the tower, someone was shouting over the radio. Another voice cracked through the base channel, asking for confirmation. "We have movement at pad 6. Unscheduled. Who's in the Talon?" No answer. The screen lit with the signature, but no ID. The call sign field was blank. Elena eased the throttle forward. The wheels rolled, slow at first, then faster as she guided the jet toward the south end of the runway. No escort crew, no wing walkers, just the sound of the tires over concrete and the hum rising into vibration. A final call echoed across the channel. "Unauthorized launch. Repeat. You are not cleared. Identify immediately." She said nothing. The T-38 lifted just after the second marker line. The gear tucked in slow, hydraulics groaning. The nose climbed as the jet caught the air. Her hands stayed steady. No computer trim, no auto balance, just weight, velocity, and her read of the sky. She banked low, skimming under the primary cloud shelf, the sun slicing across the canopy like a blade of white. Below her, the canyon mouth opened wide and dark. The ridge shadow stretched long across the tree line, the depth beyond it unreadable to radar. She flew into it without pause. In the tower, a commander leaned toward the glass, eyes wide. The Talon vanished into the mountain's edge, swallowed by fog and silence. No flight plan, no transponder, just a trail of air disturbed, hanging behind her for a moment before it faded. She did not speak, she did not ask, she simply flew. The canyon opened beneath her like a corridor pulled tight between the cliffs. Fog pressed along the walls in dense layers, folding into the ridges and drawing light down into narrow bands. Elena adjusted the trim manually, reading the wind by feel as much as by gauge. The Talon pitched slightly with every correction, its frame twitching in the turbulence like a living thing. Below her, tree lines blurred into shadow. Above, the cloud ceiling dropped hard. There was no uplink, no visual assist, no synthetic overlay to trace a flight path. But Elena didn't need any of that. She flew the way she always had, by weight, by timing, by memory built through repetition and failure. The pass ahead narrowed again. She adjusted early, cutting the angle of descent 5 degrees before the ridge bend. Her left wingtip passed within meters of a rock face slick with condensation. Then she saw it. Smoke. It wasn't high or wide, just a narrow column twisting upward through the fog break. Her breath caught. She brought the nose lower, throttled down to reduce engine wash, and traced the edge of the visible slope. Through the haze, a small orange flare bloomed once. Someone was alive. She dipped the wings to mark it. One slow arc, then a second. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't part of any approved maneuver set, but she had done it before years ago, on a recon pass that lost comms in the Andes. It was enough. If anyone was watching, they would see. A moment later, a shadow passed high above her. One of the medevac helicopters had finally reached the ridgeline. Its rotors stirred the fog into eddies, but it didn't descend. Another followed behind, circling just above the cloud shelf. They were waiting. No clearance, no vector path, no data. Elena keyed her mic. Her voice came through steady. "I have visual on crash smoke. Coordinates approximate. I'll draw your corridor. Follow my path." Static responded. Then a clipped voice from the lead medevac pilot. "Do we have route clearance?" "No," said another voice. Someone further back on the channel. "We don't have anything." The first voice came back. "Lower, then follow her." Elena climbed briefly to reset her approach, then angled the Talon into a downward spiral, shallow and smooth. The descent cut through the fog in a visible coil, her engine heat etching a line the medevacs could track. She ran the pattern tight enough to avoid rock face interference, wide enough for rotor clearance. Her altimeter buzzed once as she passed below 600 feet. Still no instruments. Still no readout. Just motion and instinct. The first helicopter dropped in behind her. The second followed. She didn't look back. At the bottom of the turn, she leveled out and passed directly above the crash site. She could see the shattered aircraft on the slope. Nose buried. One wing bent like a twisted blade. The survivor knelt beside the wreckage, waving with one arm while keeping the other braced against a flare launcher. Elena rocked her wings one more time, just enough to cast shadow and signal. She didn't stay. As the medevacs dropped into their hover pattern, Elena pulled the Talon back into a climb. The engine strained, gears humming louder now, fuel reading dipping close to red again. She ignored it. The fog peeled away in pockets as she climbed. Below, the sound of rotor blades reached through the clouds, rising like distant thunder. "Rescue in progress," someone said on the open channel. Another voice came through softer. "That's her. That's the Talon." No rank, no name, just shape and motion. Elena climbed until the ridge fell away beneath her. The sun broke through in a narrow band above the upper ledge. The turbulence lessened. Her hands stayed on the controls. Fingers relaxed. The Talon held. She banked once, wide and clean, then disappeared behind the rise. The runway came into view as a pale stripe through residual heat shimmer. It looked narrower than before, uneven along the edges where gravel had crept up from the perimeter. The wind had shifted again, now coming low across the southern flank, but the approach was still flyable. Elena adjusted the trim manually, easing the Talon into descent without a single automated assist. The control stick buzzed faintly under her grip. One of the flaps lagged slightly. She compensated. The wheels touched down harder than she would have liked, the left gear catching first. The frame groaned with the weight and age of metal that hadn't flexed in weeks. One of the bolts in the seat track jolted upward, just enough to be felt. The canopy vibrated in sympathy. But the Talon stayed level. The nose gear held. The tires rolled, then slowed. She kept her hands on the controls until full stop. For a moment, everything was still. Across the airstrip, a group of maintenance personnel stood frozen beside a fuel truck. Two techs held headset rigs they hadn't lifted. Near the corner of the hangar, one of the younger pilots leaned half out of a support cart, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. No one said anything. The Talon's canopy lifted slowly, letting the hot air spill out of the cockpit. Elena unbuckled her harness and practiced motion. Her gloves were worn soft now, the right one nearly threadbare at the edge of the thumb. She removed her helmet and set it on the dash. It had no call sign, no tape label, no unit sticker, just a dull curve of plastic and faded scuffs. In the distance, the sound of rotors beat through the haze. The medevac helicopters were returning, engines throttled low, their bellies heavy with cargo, and one survivor. The first bird touched down gently near the temporary field station. The second landed moments later, kicking up dust that rolled toward the hangar bay. Elena stepped down from the jet and stood beside it without speaking. Her boots hit the pavement hard enough to echo, but no one moved. One of the stretcher teams opened the side door and lifted the downed pilot into view. His arm was bandaged and braced. His helmet hung from a strap. As they turned the stretcher, his gaze caught hers. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just looked at her, steady and direct, for the full length of the walk. No one spoke between them. They didn't have to. Inside the operations tent, the post-incident report had already begun. Officers circled the table, trying to frame the sequence. One summary read route anomaly. Another listed visual marker descent as the reason medevac reached the crash. One supervisor stated firmly that an unconfirmed aircraft had entered the zone. No identification confirmed. Possibly an early relay craft from a nearby outpost. Someone else cleared their throat, looked at the weather logs, then said it quiet. She flew that canyon cold. The room fell silent for one breath. Then the conversation resumed, low and controlled. Elena didn't go to the debrief. She didn't wait for orders or sign-offs. She returned to the Talon and climbed back into the cockpit for a moment. Not to prep it, not to shut it down, just to leave something. She pulled her gloves from her belt and placed them on the panel. Palms down, fingertips forward. The right glove curled slightly from use. The left was still marked with a faint grease stain from the week she rewired the backup transponder. She didn't wipe it off. The cabin smelled of sweat and engine heat and the dust that lived inside old vents. She didn't linger. As she stepped away, she reached once more into her binder and pulled the red grease pencil she used for every map. She set it beside the gloves and closed the canopy without a word. The latch clicked soft. Final. Across the field, a few heads turned. Most didn't speak. One crew chief raised a hand halfway, then let it fall. A logistics officer frowned but said nothing. In the hangar storage room, tucked behind a stack of old intake filters, was a wall she had once used to pin terrain sketches and supply corrections. She hadn't touched it in months. But now, as she passed through, she stopped. The concrete was cool to the touch. She pulled a piece of chalk from her jacket pocket, a habit she never explained, and wrote a single word in square. Clear print. Flown. Then she walked out. She wasn't on the roster. She didn't have a call sign. No one called her name when the mission began. And yet, when everything else failed, she was the one who flew. Elena's story isn't about breaking rules. It's about remembering who you are when the world forgets. It's about quiet strength, earned skill, and the kind of courage that doesn't ask for credit. She didn't fly for applause. She flew because someone needed her to. And that was enough. If you've ever felt overlooked, if you've ever been told to wait on the sidelines while others took the sky, remember this story. Sometimes the person no one watches is the one who brings everyone home. Thank you for listening. If this story spoke to you, share your thoughts in the comments or follow for more stories like this where quiet strength rises, even when no one is watching.